Hi everyone, thanks again for joining the Canonical Open Documentation Academy office hours. A couple of small updates. We've gone past the 100 task threshold on the repository. We've got 33 closed tasks there, and there are currently 35 open, and there are some unassigned tasks, which is good and unusual. If you're interested in learning about NetPlan or Ubuntu packaging, there's some of the more recent tasks that have been created on there. We also updated the README this week to add some details on the contributor license agreement that some of our projects require and some other projects may require in the future as well. Really just an explanation of why we have that and what the expectations are on you if you contribute to those tasks. We haven't found it a problem with any of the tasks previously, apart from the actual technical side of it, in that some of our projects automatically test for the CLA being signed when the when the contributions are merged, and this sometimes breaks. But we're also hopeful that that breakage has been fixed and the whole process has been streamlined a little bit. Today, Kitana has offered to do a presentation on what we're calling technical author or technical writer. It's a distinction that is at the moment kind of unique to Canonical, but it's a great idea, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Kitana. Over to you, Kitana.
Thanks very much, Graham. So let me just present my screen. Hope that comes up.
Yeah, looks good. Looks good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Kirtana. I'm a technical author at Canonical, and today it is this new and exciting idea that we are going to discuss about these two roles. And let's jump right into it. So the idea I'm going to talk about is that these two roles, technical writer and technical author, are very different. Currently, due to the way job titles work in the industry, these two titles are being used interchangeably. There are a lot of job postings out there that have both of these roles as the titles for talent that they are seeking. However, companies do not seem to consciously reflect on their requirements, and that seems to be the cause for such ambiguity. Artem discussed some of these points during his talk last week. Essentially, what it comes down to, the difference between these two roles, is the differing documentation culture or a company's attitude towards documentation. How important is documentation for the company? Where does it stand in shaping the future of the company's products? So if you think about these questions, these kind of shape what the company is looking for, and that shapes the job description, and that reflects throughout the entire hiring process. So the role of a technical author is not unique to Canonical, but I think, like Graham said, the definition is, at the risk of sounding a little bit boastful, I believe Canonical is one of the very few companies that has reflected their skill requirements very clearly in the job description. I will discuss the keywords used in a good technical author's job description a bit later, but let's first look at what could be the differences between these two roles that look so familiar and like so similar at first glance, but they have very subtle differences that make a big difference. So a technical writer is often tasked with all the documentation work, often with little or no support from the engineering team or anyone else for that matter. So it depends on the industry really, and the nature of the product. It could require a certain amount of discipline to follow instructions rather than to challenge existing team practices or product development strategies. For example, imagine you're writing a manual for how to use medical equipment or aircraft. So for such products where safety is really key and you can't like really put a step out of the line, there's not a lot of room to challenge things. It needs to be written in a certain way, and that requirement shapes the role of technical writer. In most of these cases, documentation is a legal requirement, a checkbox that needs to be checked before shipping the product. Uh, because of this, it may not be considered as an integral part of the product development process. Like I said, it works for certain industries and products, but applying that as a thumb rule for all the products doesn't seem right. Unfortunately, this role's definition is so commonplace that it has become the norm. What many companies fail to understand is the difference in requirements. So, as preparation, I went into LinkedIn, I looked at a lot of job descriptions, and this seemed to be the pattern. The companies didn't, the companies or the hiring leads who are posting these requirements didn't seem to reflect on certain questions. Do they need someone who can challenge their product's, let's say, design? Would the product benefit from such a challenge? Would it be more efficient if the engineers who built the product take part in documentation activities? Of course, they might need somebody who helps them with the documentation challenges or get them through the first steps. But would it be better? So, not understanding this could really as in could lead to really good technical authors working in stealth mode as technical writers. So their role on paper as designation would be technical writers, but if they had the technical authority, if they were given the freedom, they can influence the product. But they are unable to because the expectations that are set for a technical writer role don't often align with what they do. Instead, they are seen as being nosy or like the work is an additional overhead and they don't really need to do that. So let's consider what is the extent of a technical author's role. A technical author is someone who must have technical authority. So they know enough about the product that they participate in product development strategy and shape how the product develops. This does not mean that they don't write documentation or they don't participate in like updating the documentation. They will, but they will have a much deeper relationship with their engineering team. They will help the engineering team create and maintain accurate documentation. They will help the engineers, the marketing team, the web and design teams, and all of these cross functional teams to understand why it might be better for the product to do something else than usual. Why it might be good to think about forming that bridge between the mental model of the product's maker and that of its user. So, in such teams, documentation is often considered as part of their engineering practice. It's not some separate work stream where they don't have to think about it until they reach a certain checkpoint. So when you start thinking about documentation right from the start, the focus shifts. While the focus of a technical writer would be to communicate well, the focus of a technical author would be to think if we are communicating the right things and to change them when required. A technical author is often required to establish and drive documentation standards across company. So that may include breaking down stuff before they start building them up. Not everyone enjoys doing this, and it's not an easy task as well. And that's why I believe this distinction in the role requirements is so important to understand. While all of this talk of technical authority and challenging things, as thrilling as it may sound, it does not come easy. It requires careful consideration from the part of the person who's doing the role. There needs to be enough support on the company's side. The team should support the technical author who's trying to change things. So it's not a piece of cake. So, due to the difference in this documentation culture, a technical writer's influence can be restricted. It's not because that they choose to do that. Often, you find many technical writers wanting to do more, but it is just that they are unable to due to a lot of factors, lack of opportunities, lack of support, or it's just like not enough bandwidth because they're solely responsible for creating and maintaining the entire documentation. Where's the time to do anything else? So A technical writer's influence often extends to their engineering team and the writer's team if one exists. So rarely do they get to think about documentation in any other context, even if they want to. Uh, by definition, if you look at a technical author's role, a technical author's influence overlaps with a technical writer's, but it also has these extensions. So when given the right authority and combine that with the passion and technical curiosity to shape the product, that's when I think a technical author is born. It happens when you have the freedom to explore, when you have the freedom to challenge. It also tends to happen in a situation where you may be lucky enough to be the lone technical writer in the company and you're given the magic wand to make things happen. So, I mean, you can take your own decisions and you try to do different things and you find out that there are much more things that you as a technical writer can do to make it better for the product. So if you look at some of the relationships that technical authors can establish, I have listed a few common examples like UX, field engineering, product management, support. So all these collaborations allow them to elevate the documentation and its standards to a different level. So the author constantly needs to collaborate and work with these cross-functional teams to do their job. So every day they think about all of these aspects and apply their learnings into developing product documentation. So it gives multiple vantage points to the development of the product's documentation. So to understand the extent to which this kind of requirements and culture shape the role, let's look at job descriptions. So like I said, I went and looked at multiple job postings on LinkedIn to see how it is currently. So this is an adaptation from an existing job posting. This looks like a typical job description and the list of responsibilities for a technical writer job. It talks about like so many years of experience, like you need to be able to create good documentation, you need to have knowledge of said tools, meeting deadlines, etc. If this list interests and excites me, I would be perfectly happy to apply for it. I'm not saying this is not good, but let's keep this aside and look at the technical author's job description. See the keywords that are highlighted here. Those are the key differentiators when a company is interested in doing the tasks that are listed on the right. If you look at the keywords that are highlighted and the action words on the task list on the right, what you'll do on a regular basis, you can come up or see things that really brings out the authority, influence the product, support community, standardize the structure, advanced documentation, understanding. So all these are different aspects of product documentation that is a little bit more than just creating and maintaining product documentation. So as an applicant, it is important to learn to spot these seemingly small things in the description and self-reflect. What is it that you most enjoy? Do you enjoy the discipline that comes with communicating information well? Or do you enjoy shaking things up, creating standards that others can follow, or talking to multiple people about the product and trying to inculcate those learnings into documentation? So this is important because at times requirements look like the earlier slide when they should actually be looking like this slide, or the reverse as well. And we realize it a little bit too late. So if we can look at these indicators that assure us of what we need and what is it that we enjoy the most, and if we are able to match that as an applicant, I think the suitability for the job role would be much better. So to recap, the difference in these roles is not really in the title, but rather in how you and the company hiring you look at it. It's not that one of these roles is better and the other one is not. It's definitely not that. It is just that they're really two different things. Most jobs in the market may seem like a mix of these two roles. It's up to you to decide what suits you best. So in addition to identifying these small things in the job description, I'll admit, which is really not that easy or straightforward, ask questions during the interviews that will get you the right answers for what is expected of you. Match that with what you're looking for. So evaluate the role and the documentation culture as much as the company is evaluating you. It's a two-way street. So find out if that matches your inner calling. It's a little bit of extra work, but you won't regret it. And with that, I thank you for your time, and thanks to all my fellow technical authors for helping me with this talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Kitana. That was really good. I know you put a lot of effort into researching the roles and the job descriptions. I've got a question maybe to start with, if anybody else wants to ask any questions afterwards. But in your opinion, do you think most technical writers would kind of benefit for having more of that kind of authority that comes from the technical author role that you described?
Definitely. I mean, having been a technical writer for a long time myself, I definitely think so, because I have often felt the need or the interest to do more. But restrictions or the expectations came in the way. So it was often considered not my job to look into certain things, but I was always poking my nose into, like, I mean, how is the product's design, or how is this user interface going to help the users? So it definitely helps. And I think a lot of excellent technical writers can, I mean, if it suits their interest, can change or shift to being technical authors. It's really a parallel. So uh, it would definitely benefit. Yeah.
Does that any like to invite anybody else to ask any questions if they do have any, and we can try and answer them collectively rather than put all the pressure on Kitana. I'd be interested to hear from anyone who's worked as a technical writer, to hear what their thoughts on this is. I think a lot of us have worked as technical writers for some time, and whether you think this is like a positive direction to take the discipline, or could yeah, Julia, go for it.
Hi, yes. So before this role at Canonical, I was indeed a technical writer for many years. And I agree with what Kirtana said, and we did collaborate a little bit before, finalizing the presentation. I think there is much truth. It depends on the sector, like on the sector that you work in. For example, if you're doing devices, documentation, medical, mission critical, you cannot have much room for improvisation or creativity. But I think in the software industry, technical writers could really bring more to the table, and it's mostly up to the company where they work at. I've also been the lone technical writer kind of person, and yes, that does come with a lot of freedom, a lot of responsibility, because there's nobody you can kind of piggyback on, but you have to carve your own path. So yes, if you are looking for a job in documentation, I would definitely advise to ask questions during the interview process, read carefully what is being advertised, and try to see if that's what you want, because these are two different types of roles. I mean, despite the name or the title, which often doesn't, necessarily reflect what you're going to do, but pay attention to the clues. Are you going to have freedom, responsibility, or are you just expected to follow precise guidelines, and that's that.
Thanks, Julia. That makes sense. Ruth.
Yeah, I feel it's a bit difficult to actually to separate this into two roles, because I feel it's a spectrum. So it's kind of any work we do as technical writers, technical authors, is going to be somewhere in there. And as Artem was pointing out last week, so often companies don't really know what they want. So in my opinion, this is very much up to the individual to kind of define their role. Of course, if you have like a huge company with a lot of technical writers and they have a very clear role description, that's a different story. But most companies will have one or a couple of technical writers, authors. They often won't really know what they want, and it really depends on the individual how much you reach out. So I totally agree with that. You can work in these roles in very different ways, just as Katana was saying. But I would not want to put like different terms and say like when if you're working in one of those roles, would you even know if that's on the technical writer side or is it on the technical author side? Like, where do you make the split? Because you could be in some of the aspects, like the company could have a great documentation culture, but you don't have access to the people that could give you the input that you need or that you could talk to because there's no time, or they sit somewhere else and are not never available, things like that. Or the other way around, you could be very involved, but documentation is really seen as a bit of an afterthought. So I feel it's a spectrum, and it's a spectrum on the different aspects. So that's why I can't see where you would really have a cutoff point between the two roles.
Yeah, Julia's saying that she agrees with Ruth that it's a spectrum and not a clear-cut definition. Listening to you talking, I think all of us are trying to create the best possible documentation we can. And this is a strategy for producing regardless of kind of the process or where one role starts or one role finishes. It's a strategy towards creating the best documentation. And actually, we've got Daniela here, who's the architect behind the idea. And one thing I wanted to ask, him, is how much support does this require from the organization, do you think? Is it something that a technical writer could fight for in their organization if it's something that they believe strongly in? Does it need to come from the bottom up, or does it come from the top down, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I suspect that a technical writer in an organization with plenty of holes and weaknesses could grasp that power. So, for example, somebody described being the sole technical writer in a small organization. You could well find yourself being able to demand that influence. But in many organizations, that wouldn't be the case. You might be part of the technical writing pool, and your job description would be very defined, and it would be very unexpected if you were to try and step out of it. So, I think the situations as well as the formal expectations also apply. You might find yourself in a situation that is amenable to that. I did want to say something about this. The idea of the spectrum is interesting, but I think that might be true. But there are definitely places where one of these kinds of people might be welcome and not. So, for example, clearly where we're working here, we do need technical authors, people who are going to be technical authors and not technical writers. But I can see places where having somebody with a technical author mentality would not be welcome. So if you're writing documentation for calibrating medical or pharmaceutical machinery, your job is not to have inventive ideas about better ways of designing the product. That's really not your job. You would be dangerous if you took that attitude. Your job is to communicate the things that you are needed to communicate in the right kind of ways that will be expected to be consumed. So there will be roles where you would not succeed as a technical author if you went in with that mentality. So even if many roles are on the spectrum, some clearly, I think, are not.
Yeah, Kitana, it's all yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment to Ruth's observation as well. So I think it is reflective of the company's documentation culture. If a technical writer or author, whatever the role is, if they cannot have access to people who really can influence the documentation. So I know it's really difficult because it involves a lot of people, and change is not easy when you're trying to bring it across uh, different teams. But this is where I feel it comes a little bit from the top down. So if the leadership, if the company's direction involves having documentation as part of their engineering practice, and if that's what they want to do, if that's what they believe in, then they should really work towards making all these cross-functional teams work together. That includes a technical writer, and it will provide the resources that they need to fulfill the role of a technical author, like as per the definition that we are discussing, but it will provide them more resources essentially.
Peter's raised a good question in the comments, and it's is there an overlap between the tech author role and product manager role? This has come up before. This is interesting. It's a really good question, Peter. I don't know if you want to try and answer that one, Daniele.
Well, what about Kitana?
I mean,
Maybe
so
Kitana's got a thought.
yeah, go.
I don't think there is much overlap, but I can't say there is none either, because the way a technical author has to think about the product when you're creating documentation, it also looks at how you present the product in the market. But I feel that it ends up focusing more on technical accuracy and how the user looks at the product, what are the different ways that they could use the product. So I feel the overlap exists, but it's not a big one.
Yeah. I think they have to be really talking to each other, though, so that the technical author understands the perspective that the product manager is seeing. Actually, Peter, I think there might be a stronger overlap between somebody who does support roles and somebody who is a technical author, because there you still have that customer perspective coming in and needing to be answered, but now you're dealing with the user who's already engaged with the product, who's having problems with the product. So I think that's where I would see a strong overlap.
Something I wanted to mention, which is perhaps a bit too cynical, but in my time working with documentation, I've often found that the people responsible for making strategic documentation decisions are not the best people to be making those decisions. They're usually people not directly related with the creation of the documentation or leading the documentation. And that affects the way that documentation is published, the amount of time and expectations that people have in terms of working on it. And I think that is a real struggle for a lot of technical writers and a lot of organizations to overcome, because there's a distrust of putting effort into documentation and trust in the people whose primary responsibility it is to drive that documentation. There's a disconnect there between the leadership basically and the documentation efforts. And I think what this does clarify is that you have to just trust in the technical authors and the documentation teams to make their own decisions for whatever good reasons they communicate, but you have to trust in them to do it. And Kitana, you mentioned that it was empowering, and I think a lot of it is about empowering those people to do the job that they've been hired to do, and just for the rest of the organization to trust in their decisions. Anyone else want to ask anything? Anyone brave enough?
Now, where did you find the that technical writer job description?
Yeah, so I went through technical writer postings on LinkedIn. Most of them had the same template. So I mean, I looked at 2 or 3 popular or top well-known companies, and it followed the same pattern. So
Katona, you mentioned that you'd worked as a technical writer and now as a technical author. What do you think produces the better outcome?
It again really depends on the product. So I have only worked in software product documentation. So I have never, I always knew that I can experiment. It's not like I have to be restricted by the rules. So I think being a technical author at Canonical, this 1 year has made me feel more empowered and made me learn a lot more things, and applying that to create product documentation has produced the better outcome, I would say. I mean, this is just my personal experience, but there has been quite sometimes when I felt something could be good for the product. For example, I can remember an instance where we were asked to create a troubleshooting guide, which was absolutely, in my opinion, useless because all of the information was there, right there in the other user guides and manuals. And it was just a matter of making them more clear for the user. But certain decisions are taken out of your hands, or if you're not in the position to make those decisions, it just falls on you to just follow the rules. So when you're given the freedom to make decisions, it's obviously better for you, it's better for your career, it's better for the product, because it becomes a collective decision. I mean, there's room for discussion. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask the devil's advocate question in this. Does this mean that the engineers or the software developers need to be good at writing if they're working with a technical author and they're expected to take more of an active role in documenting their own work? Do you have to hire developers who are provably better good writers?
I don't think so. Like, at least my opinion is that that's why we are there, right? To help them like learn to put their thoughts into words, even if they're not that comfortable writing. I think throughout the process it comes, because I find that actually most engineers are good at writing because it's their product. It's I mean, they've spent so much time into it. They're very excited to talk about it. They're very excited to write about it. So I think the only gaps that we need to fill are maybe the perspective of documentation challenges that come into picture. Okay, when an engineer talks about their product, they talk about everything, the most intricate details of the product, which may or may not relate to the users. So filtering that out so we can act as a channel, and the process will empower them. That's my belief, and that has been my experience as well.
I mean, I found that there are developers who enjoy working with documentation and writing and are good at it, but then there are developers who hate it, and there's nothing I can do to convince them otherwise. And I worry slightly that the people who kind of profess an enjoyment for writing become, lumberd's the wrong word, but that's how they feel, and that stops them kind of engaging with the problems in a way that they may do otherwise if it was more equally shared across the team.
I understand. We can't force someone if they really don't like writing, or like writing about things. That's fine. But I think most times, if they see the value that documentation brings to the product, or if they clearly see that visible translation, like some customer appreciating the way documentation is written, and because of that they were able to achieve something easily, which otherwise they would have spent hours pondering about it. So I think that feeling of accomplishment or feeling of achievement really makes a difference. Maybe exposure to that may change the mindset, but it really depends, yeah, whether you like it or not in the end.
Yeah, Daniela.
Can I ask a question, Kitana? So you've been talking a lot about writing just now, about developers writing. Now, Do you think that the biggest challenge in documentation, or even the biggest part of the documentation role, is writing? Or do you think it's actually a different kind of, is it a challenge of thinking about how to frame and communicate ideas rather than a problem of writing?
I believe when we start with the role, a major part of it is writing, because that's how you mostly learn about the product. So, of course, you meet with engineers, you have these discussions, you try to understand about the product, but when you write about it, when you think about how you will put it on paper, that's when you really learn a lot about the product. So, when you start newly, it's a lot of writing. And as you get more comfortable with the product, it becomes more about framing things, as you rightly put it. So you think about, like, you reach a certain stage where you have written about the existing features, and then you think, okay, what can I do to make this better? What is this missing? So you agonize over it. It's an iterative procedure, I believe. You look at the topic again and again, and every time you make some small improvement, and it reads better. So, like, how many times we as writers, like, we look back at some documentation that we have written like many years ago, or like a couple of years ago, and oh, I can't believe I wrote that. It's absolutely, I mean, bullshit. So it's
That's the stuff I wrote last week.
yeah, that's the process that we go through as writers. I actually have a question for you, Daniele. So when you had to create this job description, did you have any existing resources? Did you see other companies or any other companies as viewers it may be doing this kind of distinction? I mean, what was the seed for this idea?
No, I didn't see others. And, well, Graham, you'll remember you and Nick and I spent a long time thinking about how the interview process would work to uncover the things that we were looking for. And it wasn't what Canonical was expecting at that time either. So it took a while before actually it was accepted, even here at Canonical. I think they were looking for something, even then, quite a bit more traditional.
The reason I asked is because when I was researching these job descriptions, I did try to search with technical author, and it didn't result. I mean, the search didn't give us many results. There were a lot of fancy titles: user assistance developer, knowledge base editor. I think
Information architect, probably.
yeah, information architect, information developer.
Yeah.
But this was one of the less common, and I think I could only see Canonical's posting there. So I was just wondering. I mean, I don't know. It may be the search may be restricted to my locale, because I think Artem mentioned that this is more common in UK-based companies. So I was thinking whether it's just the terminology or that's there in the culture. Yeah.
I would say this is just an ad hoc observation. I'm not entirely sure I'm correct, but I have a strong feeling that I am.
Okay.
Can we, Peter, I wanted to ask about your question and why did you ask that? Peter, I'm not hearing you at all. You're coming through terribly distorted.
Pretty muffled. Yeah. No, it's the same.
That's not an improvement.
Any better now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, it just sounded the way Katana described it, the technical author role, that it possibly could have an effect on the way the product is developed. So, you know, some liaison would be necessary with the product manager. So I suppose at least that the project manager is in agreement with the documentation approach.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's quite perceptive, because one of the things that we have here is an exercise. We don't call it an agreement exercise, but we call it an alignment exercise to make sure that the product side and the engineering side, usually represented by the technical author, are in fact in complete agreement about what the product is, what it does, who it's for, what problems it solves, what the customers want, and so on. Because that has to be something that the technical author cares about and really understands, whereas a technical writer might not necessarily be touching those things, but the technical author really must respond to what's coming from outside, from the customer and the potential user. Yeah. There's another kind of user that, or no, not user, another kind of persona that I think is quite important in this conversation, and that is the open source software contributor, or the open source software creator, who's often not part of a company or a big team, or they might be a part of only of a voluntary organization, but they are contributing to their own project or a group project, and they will have to contribute code and documentation, and they are often the programmer / developers who has to do some writing as well. And I think that's one of the perspectives that aligns quite strongly with that of the technical author, the person who's got this sense of what's happening inside the machinery because they envisioned it. And often they're not very good writers, but that doesn't stop them from being good authors, because they're solving different problems from writing problems. They're solving problems about how to really put into words what this product is trying to do.
Hi, Fabrice. That's an interesting. So do you think then, maybe an open question, is there a role for technical author in open source projects?
Well, it depends what you mean by Ubuntu is an open source project, and there's some open. What kind of, do you mean the small little project or the voluntary project?
I kind of mean in general, in the ways that we could help with the academy, or maybe yes, I could see how there would be in an Ubuntu, but maybe in the smaller. Is it advantageous to a project that somebody's acting in a technical author-like role in terms of producing good quality documentation?
Yeah, okay, so for example, look at the documentation of something like Python. That's a big open source project, one of the underpinning millions of other projects. And I think that's desperately in need of technical authors to take some control of the documentation, to impose some discipline on that. But it definitely, I don't think that could be possibly be done from just from a technical writer perspective. It has to be somebody who's very close up with that.
I mean, that's something we could actually help with in terms of reaching out to projects and helping them with like being that technical author role for open source projects that may need that kind of guidance. Artem, go for it.
Yeah, I was about to add that, in my opinion, individual open source projects not necessarily need a technical author as we understand it, but groups of projects and ecosystems of projects definitely do, because we can look at this role as a disciplinarian, as someone who does the thinking instead of writing on and on. Maybe a coordinator, someone like that. And in this sense, open source would greatly benefit from having people like that, because no matter what we call them, there is, I wouldn't say urgent, but a really, really painful need for people who would take charge of the documentation effort, not even on the daily basis, but on raising the general level of awareness. We can call this, I don't know, documentation evangelist, whatever, really. There's a lot of similar stuff going on with coding and development, and a lot of effort goes into that, and some effect can be already seen. But this is simply not happening with documentation, because it's the perpetually unloved child of any endeavor in open source, I'm afraid.
Hi, welcome to the couple of people who've just joined. We're just actually talking about the differences between technical author as a role and a technical writer as a role, in the way that we're trying to clarify the kind of leadership and direction that derives from being an author than perhaps more traditionally is the writing part associated with being a writer. And whether open source projects could benefit from having somebody take on such a role. I actually know a couple of projects that pay technical writers as consultants, open source projects that pay technical writers as consultants, because the engineering teams themselves don't want to think about the problem in that kind of big view, and they don't want to take responsibility for making those decisions. And I worry about going into those projects and kind of taking over, or being seen as taking over in this kind of position. But I really do think they could help with somebody doing that. They could benefit from somebody doing that. We've got a couple more minutes if anybody wanted to raise any other questions. Yeah, Iqbal, a lot of open source projects are lucky to exist. I mean, what do you mean by that? Because I guess they're responsible for their own existence. It's right. Oh yes, yeah. I mean, for other people, that we're lucky that as consumers of those projects. Yeah, I know the blog post you're referring to. We're very lucky that there are individuals out there who are maintaining so much important infrastructure that we all rely on, as of course. And yeah, maybe this aspect I haven't actually considered actually offering strategic help in the way that authors might do, in the way that we're defining it, in terms of how people may approach their documentation. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties that we might have is that whereas we have a very good understanding of what the standards of good are in, say, software engineering, like we understand that test coverage and automated testing and practices, and we have all kinds of ways of looking at something from the outside and saying, oh yeah, this is good quality work. We understand the processes. That doesn't really exist for documentation. So it's very difficult for somebody to come in. Every time somebody comes in with the status of expert, they've got to explain from the beginning why they are an expert. They've got to explain from the beginning what is good, what is a good practice, why this is a good practice and that's not a good practice. And that people think they know about documentation in ways that they don't have. They'd be shocked if somebody came up with the same kind of assumptions about engineering. I think in that respect, documentation is a bit like design. Everybody thinks that they know about design. They've got opinions on it. And that does make it difficult to change things unless you're invited in to change them. And even sometimes when you are invited in to change them, then you run into those questions. I don't know if people have had that kind of experience, whether in engineering or in a project, perhaps.
I certainly have. Any more questions before Iqbal, go ahead. You can type it out if you feel more comfortable. My thoughts exactly. I can't go to a project and say I want to help improve documentation without, in many cases, risking offending the developers.
Yeah. Well, I've done that, and you can, but you have to have that relationship in place already.
Maybe we could encourage projects to advertise their need for somebody to come in, and they're open for people to come in and offer their services to do such a thing. If there was a label or something to say, look, we're looking for some kind of documentation leadership or ideas, somebody to kind of engage in the conversations. Yeah. Well, I'm going to stop the recording in a minute. Iqbal saying, I either make myself more likable or improve their docs. I totally relate to that. And at some point you're going to make yourself unlikable and just to improve the docs. And I think that's just something you have to do. And in the end, they'll see that their docs bring people happiness and they'll like you again. I'm going to thanks everyone for joining and engaging with the conversation. I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anybody wants to ask any questions outside of the recording, so that it isn't formal at all, please go ahead. But otherwise, thank you so much, Kitana, for putting all that together. Really interesting. I feel like ever we have more to say on this and more things to ask, but really appreciate it. Thanks, Kitana.